Chow, chow. Hands up! Both hands, mother... On the ground now. I don't need you talking. On the ground. Don't sweat this, what the that's it.
911 gets a call, and there's a voice on the phone saying, help, it's garbled, they're trying to figure out exactly what's going on.
I have an officer there, but you have to go to the door. Can you hear me?
Uniformed patrol deputies get there, they're trying to make contact. It's late, it's dark, they can't hear anything. They do a safety sweep of the house to try to locate if there's been a crime.
You could see blood all over the ground and a trail of blood that led up to the front of the house. I approached the house and could see bloody handprints down the wall, all over the threshold of the door. Opening the door, there's just a large pool of blood. You could tell that someone had been laying on the ground in that blood. We located a female on her bed, covered in blood, and she had a gunshot wound to her face.
They begin life-saving measures with her. When somebody's shot in the face, it's really time-sensitive to get them medical attention. Her potential for survival, we were not very confident. We didn't know if she was going to make it through the night or if she was going to be in a coma. We had no idea.
I loved my sister. People thought we were twins, 13 months apart. We just had fun together. We'd go into the woods next to Mom's house where we lived and grew up, build teepees and little houses out into the woods. Very, very simple life. People remember her kindness. She loved everyone. She would help everyone. She would give you the shirt off of her back. She was truly a one of a kind.
You have one shot at a crime scene to do it right. You're looking for everything. Everything that you look at is potential clue, is potential evidence. When we went into Angela's house, the house was in disarray. We weren't sure what we had yet. But anytime that someone receives a gunshot wound to the head and there's nobody on scene, you have to look at a potential suicide attempt.
Inside the house, there was a small chair to the side, and immediately you could see the shininess of a cartridge casing. You could see a gunshot that went through the window directly behind the chair.
The projectiles were there, but there was no weapons found on the property. We weren't sure still exactly what had happened. The only person that can tell us is the victim.
When I arrived at the hospital, it was very important for me to try to communicate with Angie. I could look at her and see that there was an injury to her nose, and it caused a significant hole in her face going into her nasal cavity. The extent of her brain damage was unknown. The extent of any lasting injuries wasn't known, but she could respond to some very basic commands. We saw her moving her hand, so we decided we were going to try to communicate with writing.
Angie, can you hear me?
Able to write down? Did you do this to yourself? Who had the gun? Okay. This is very important. What is his name? Sue knew him? Okay.
Is this the guy that worked for you out at Mom's house?
In talking with Angie, she identified Sue as the person who would know the man that shot her. And I learned that Sue was an acquaintance of Angie and had gotten her in contact with a male that had come and done some work at her house. She was able to identify him as David Wolgemuth.
Once we were able to confirm that she was stating that a subject did this to her was the first time that we were 100% confident that we were in a manhunt now, and the clock was ticking.
David worked 2 days in a row doing minor things around the house, and Angela was not impressed. So the third day that he arrived, Angela actually fired him. There's a motive right there.
Basically, once we were able to identify David Wolgemuth, we run everything. His criminal history was pretty vast. The most telling thing for us was he had recently spent more than a year in jail on a essentially cruelty to an animals charge where he had tortured and burned a cat to death. During the course of that, he burnt down his family's home in Ackworth. So we know at that point we want to talk to him.
We gathered up detectives to go track him down. Finally, they stopped at a Burger King. He was standing right outside one of the entrances. As soon as we were able to confirm that it was him, we took him into custody. He was definitely not happy that we had caught up with him.
When somebody's in custody, you want to talk to them. First, we have to decide on the interview room. Everything in a serious criminal interrogation is contrived. From the layout, how long they're going to sit by themselves. I wanted him to be able to have a safety blanket because if he says lawyer, we're done. That's it. So we decided to leave the table in the middle of the room. And we were going to sit very traditionally on one side, and he was going to sit on the other.
Okay. Just for everybody's safety, I'm going to check you one more time before we take the handcuffs off of you, okay?
All right, David. My name's Lieutenant Clark with the Sheriff's Office. I'm going to go ahead and record this that way and get a whole bunch of notes or anything, okay? So, this is Sergeant Hands.
How are you, sir?
We want to be able to talk to you about an incident that happened here recently. All right.
When somebody's in custody, you're on a clock. Now the game begins.
This is a formality for us, and I want to know what your side of the story is and why things have happened the way they did. I would love to hear what you've got to say.
We need to get him talking because we don't have anything. If he says lawyer, we're done. That's it. And a woman's life is at stake in addition to any justice that she's going to get.
Angie's personality was, she's the funny one. She was the one that, you know, just wanted people to laugh and people to have fun, things like that.
My sister had the nickname Catfish because she very seldom showed her teeth. When she smiled, she always had just a little long smile across her face. Angie was just a precious sister.
Now, tell me something, David. And my captain, you rode back here in the car with him. You said you were working, the last odd job that you had was up at, you said Angie's house in Ball Ground. When was the last time that you worked up there?
Probably something like that. Probably something like a week ago, I don't know.
About a week ago, so.
Probably more than that.
And so that's the last job that you had. What have you done in that past week?
Just different stuff to get money.
Okay.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure. Yeah.
How did y'all find me? Y'all are a lot quicker than I thought.
What do you mean we're a lot quicker than?
Y'all are a lot quicker than I thought.
He's not even asked us really why he was there or what was going on. You know, it was, hey, how'd you catch me so quick? That was a big red flag.
We all understood why we're in the same room. It was just unacknowledged.
You know, dude, we have all kinds of ways of finding people around. The fact that we're sitting here talking is what's relevant right now, right? So, you know why we're here.
Tell us how we got there.
How we got where?
Where we are now.
What are you talking about?
Tell me what happened last night.
He started realizing the magnitude of what was happening to him. So now was the time to back down. I want him to not look at us as adversaries. I want to be his friend. And that's just rapport building 101.
Here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand what all happened.
I don't really know where to start. I just couldn't.
Hey, David, look, why don't you start where you want to with it and just tell us the whole thing?
What led you the past day to us talking to you today? If I could ask you.
I'm gonna put it in general terms and kind of put it from my point of view. My fiance needed money. She's very clingy. She didn't want me to be gone all the time, but she wanted money at the same time. So I made her happy to the best of my ability.
Okay.
How much money would you say?
It's gotta be like something like $7,000 now.
So you're supporting a big chunk of her living expenses.
Yeah.
Kid, that's a huge responsibility.
Yeah.
Lay it out so that
Sharman was just, just on me like she was about money and
she's telling you she doesn't care how you get the money, just get it.
But she's saying, get it fast, get it done. And I explained to her, I don't want to do this. I don't want, have to do something illegal to, get money. But, you want me to do it in a way that's like impossible and you're like threatening to like leave me. And here I am looking, 2 years of my life is going to go down the drain. You know what I mean?
He's literally portraying himself as the victim in this scenario. It turns your stomach in that room. It starts eating at you in 360 degrees inside of you to reach out and empathize with this person. But that empathy is the only way to get his confession.
Do I have to do this? Why? You just love me for who I am.
We felt we were getting close. You could see him giving it up more and more. He hasn't said he's done anything. He's just very openly alluded to it. I want him to tell me what he did. I need him saying it.
David, look at me for a second. There's nothing we can do to change the past, right? Okay?
We've all made bad decisions. Some are worse, some aren't so bad. That's what life is. So that's where we are now. I know it can't be easy for you. I don't think you did something necessarily, maliciously. So I know you're in pain over it when you tell us, but it's going to start feeling better.
Just give me a minute.
I know it's hard, man, and I know you're not okay with it. I can see that. You're good. Take your time.
I went up there and his parents, she was asleep or whatever. It was dark and everything. Of course, it was like 11:30, 11:18, something like that, somewhere in there. I was like, okay, so I just knocked on her door and I was just like, oh, hey ma'am, I'm really hungry. I know it's late. You trying to give me something to eat? And she was like, what are you doing here? Because we had some kind of issue. I can't remember what exactly it was. It was just like a lot of people. She just decided out of nowhere she just didn't like me for whatever dumbass reason. No reason at all, really. But
Well, how long did you work for Angie?
like 2 days.
Okay.
3 days, something like that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. So you're at the door.
So she went to just close the door and like it sounded like she locked it, but I don't know, I guess instinctually I just knew it wasn't. And I just pushed it open and seen she was just sitting there on the couch and she's like, you need some food, you have some food. And I'm like, no, bitch, I'm here for your money. She's like, I ain't got nothing. So I just shot her in the face. And then she was sitting there leaning like this. And I was just so upset because I even had to do this that I just pistol whipped her in the face. The gun accidentally went off and she finally fell down, so I might have shot her a third time. I'm not entirely sure. Walked over to her purse, grabbed her wallet, and just started going back down the road I came from.
To hear him talk about it with such casual indifference was just agonizing for me. The magnitude of what he did was nowhere to be found in his soul. You realize you're talking to a sociopath. His only regret is that he did it for somebody else and now he's got to pay the price for it.
How much money did you end up getting?
Not including what possibly was on the credit cards, was about $500.
Credit cards in your book bag also?
Yeah.
Did you get anything else from there?
No, not really.
I know that was hard, and I appreciate you being honest, and I know it was difficult. We got him to confess that he did it. We got his motive. I was there. I knew I was going to have to kill her. I shot her, and I shot her for money. And then I left. And to get motive for the district attorney's office is a huge thing for investigators.
Where's that for, sir? Step this way.
We wanted to make sure we charge him with everything that he's done. And we want to make sure that he doesn't get away with shooting Angie in the face.
I'm gonna step outside for a minute, okay?
This was one of the very, very few instances that I've investigated where somebody was committing malice murder with every inch of their being. He went there to murder somebody.
Unfortunately, by the time she passed, there were so many health concerns that it went down on paper as undetermined. I was absolutely prepared to draw an indictment for murder. But we have to be able to prove that his action caused the death. Knowing that we could get the sentence based on the crimes that we already charged, it wasn't worth the risk of going to a jury and then saying, maybe not murder.
Manner of death is undetermined. When I read that, I was and am still astounded. It hurts. And it's unfair to her. It's unfair to her memory, and she's someone that doesn't have a voice anymore. So it's our responsibility to be her voice.
When she did finally come to my office and come to court, she was on a walker. She had an oxygen machine. It was hard to speak to her. There was really not much quality of life for her left after this. But she was, at that point, I think, determined to make sure that someone understood what had happened. She was willing to stand up and make sure that he didn't do this to anybody else.
It's just rough sometimes. You know, I still have dreams, things like that, and it's hard. Angie was my second mom, not only an aunt, but somebody that was there as well to, you know, help me grow up and help me raise right. I guess the biggest thing is just that I miss her.
What is the location of your emergency? We're at the Deluxe, and I don't know the address. Somebody shot. Someone shot.
You said someone was just shot?
Yes, like literally he's bleeding out right now.
Okay, are you with the guy now?
No, we were in our room. We heard gunshots. It's a motel. I mean, we're just neighbors. We're in another room.
Give me 1 second, okay?
Is there an ambulance on the way, right? 'Cause this guy's like...
Yeah, we've got units en route, okay?
Okay.
I'm talking to the calling party, just advising someone was shot and he's bleeding out. There is somebody with the victim. 5 gunshots. 69304.
Officers arrived on scene, and one of the first things they notice is a victim lying on the ground. He is bleeding. He is not conscious. Citizens were trying to render medical aid to him. He had multiple gunshot wounds to his chest, to his arm, primarily his upper body.
Anybody see anything? We heard it, and then when we opened up the door, we seen the car speeding off. And then we heard them yelling. Did you see what kind of car was it? Red SUV.
Yeah, it's open. It's cracked open.
The victim was located in front of room 123.
Wichita Police Department.
We looked at the registry from the motel, and we were able to identify the victim as Jackie Jerome.
My brother, he was a big-hearted person. He was an amazing brother, very caring. He was a certified nursing assistant. He loved taking care of people and helping everybody.
He was a really, really good guy. He would have given anybody whatever they needed if he had it or had a means to get it to help, he would.
The last thing I ever got from him, it was a GameCube game. I probably played it every day. Because we used to play games together. I just want my dad to be there.
There might be one in that door over there.
I know officers had many shell casings that they observed on the ground around where the victim was laying. Officers also observed that there were cameras that were actually at the Deluxe Inn, surveillance cameras. And anything that we can do to figure out who the suspect is or which direction he or she went is a bonus at this point. So I was very excited. You can see shadows, you can see vehicles. You couldn't identify anyone, but you could definitely see their movements and their actions. And it definitely showed that this was not just a random shooting. Our victim was targeted in this incident. So after viewing the video, it is a continuous hunt for this shooter until they are captured.
Police are looking for the suspect who killed a man at a West Wichita motel overnight. The shooting happened around 4 o'clock this morning.
Hours after the call of shots fired, police were still at the Deluxe Inn on West Kellogg, still looking at every piece of evidence in every room they could find into a shooting overnight.
There was a picture of his Durango with yellow caution tape all around it in front of a hotel. And it just said that there was a man shot. I felt sick. And almost like it wasn't real, like it wasn't really happening. And then I was like, how am I gonna tell my kids?
I instantly started bawling. I couldn't believe that it was real. He was such a big part of my life.
We did some research to find out who was actually staying in those rooms right by where his body was. We learned from a witness on scene that the person that had rented those 2 rooms was by the name of Christine Wolf. Christine was someone that we did not believe was an actual suspect. I just wanted to talk to her. So I called the number that we had in our record system. She tells me that she knows that the shooter was Corey Bentley. It's very exciting at this point because we are now able to focus more on that name, his background. There are people searching for Corey. There are people doing research to find out where his friends and family might stay, vehicles he commonly uses, etc., so we can locate him.
One of the officers had a confidential informant that provided information that somebody was trying to sell a stolen vehicle that matched the suspect vehicle in the homicide. Our Violent Crimes Task Force followed up on that information, and they actually ended up locating Corey at an apartment complex. Corey had a pickup for his arrest for first-degree murder. He had a pickup for the felon in possession of a firearm. We know that our firearm that was used in the homicide was not in custody yet, and they had received information that Corey said he's not going back to prison and that he potentially would engage in a shootout with officers.
Cooper, you on the back? Watch out, watch out. Inside. 233. Hands up! Both hands, mother. Get out here now. Get on the ground. On the ground now. I don't need you talking. On the ground.
Going slow. What the this is? Just going slow. Stay down. Y'all don't think nothing. I'm just going slow. Stay down. Y'all don't think nothing. Keep your hands out.
Oh, you can shut him down. We have one in custody.
That one cigarette, please.
Shut up!
Listen, I was confident. I was being cooperative. I just went and grabbed my lighter.
Relax. Relax.
I don't know what
you
this
hear
is
me?
for. I'm scared. What
you hear?
Is this for?
Are you listening? Relax.
Please tell me.
Everything will be explained to you.
All right, you good? Drink your soda? All right, I'm Detective Perkins. This is Detective Palmer. We're detectives of the Wichita Police Department, okay?
We had surveillance video, interviews from witnesses, but without Corey's actual confession, it's going to be a lot harder for court to get a conviction. I felt that going in and yelling at him or trying to be intimidating to him, that was not a good strategy. So Detective Palmer and I felt like if we went in and just tried to calmly talk to him, that would maybe work in our favor.
Well, Corey, obviously, you know why you're here. There was a homicide that happened yesterday morning out of the Deluxe. Your name has come up. We've talked to a lot of people. We've watched a lot of video, and we've collected a lot of evidence, okay? And I would like to know, your side of all this and exactly what happened out there.
May I ask what is being said? Because I have no problem saying what the hell I know. But everybody's pointing at me, huh?
Well, you are the one sitting here with the pickup. Yeah.
To be 100% honest, I really don't recall all of it. I was getting high with that dude before. And he gave me bath salts. And I did not know it until I started freaking out. It's just a spiral from there.
Well, tell me what happened yesterday at the hotel.
He was outside yelling.
You're gonna have to talk a little louder. I don't want you to have to keep repeating, okay?
Like, I'm sitting there in this car, freaking out. Like, people walked up to the car and was saying stuff, and he was circling around the car, and then I didn't know what the hell was going on, except I was scared and this guy was causing my fear. I didn't know what to do.
He's not actually crying, but his voice is kind of shaking. I think some of that is real and some of that is a little maybe of a staged type of thing. He has not taken any of this blame for himself. He's almost acting like he's the victim in this and he's the one that should be, coddled like a child.
Who's this guy to you? So you said he gave you bath salts. And did he sell them to you or did he just give them to you?
He sold them to me.
Okay. How much did he sell them to you for?
I only had $15.
Did you finish it, all the $15 worth? Okay. What did you think it was? What did he tell you it was?
Worried. ice.
Mm-hmm.
That's what, I just thought it was a weird cut because it wasn't cracking right. It wasn't.
Yeah. And
then I just started freaking out on everybody. I started getting scared. I just remember the car being surrounded. That's the last thing I remember.
Is the car, you said, what did you say, the car being surrounded? Okay. I'm just trying to hear, it's hard to understand you. I'm just making sure I understand what I'm hearing from you.
It's hard to say because I know I'm going to jail.
Okay.
I just don't want
I
don't want to die in prison now. All because of meth habit.
It wasn't the bath salts that killed Jackie. Somebody has to physically pull that trigger. I know what the right answer is. They are just not telling it to me.
And sometimes you just have to take a chance during these interviews and push a little farther, a little harder.
What was he saying to you when he's around your vehicle, or when he's around the vehicle? What do you remember him saying?
I just remember pulling up and the people surrounding him. I just was so damn scared of that. And like the guy, he said something and instantly my eyes just locked onto him. And I was freaking the out. And I'm like, I just remember screaming for my mom.
You were screaming for your mom?
I screamed for my mom and then ran at her.
In Corey's interview, he finally felt comfortable telling us tiny bits of the truth in very small pieces. I felt that at that point, I think he was almost maybe waiting for someone to stop beating around the bush and just ask the direct question.
Why'd you shoot him?
When somebody's describing an incident to me in great detail, but they're leaving out the detail about the actual incident, I know that they know that missing piece. They're just choosing not to tell us at that point.
Corey, why'd you shoot him? How many times you recall pulling the trigger?
I kept going and going and going until I was gone, and I kept going and going and going.
Did you unload the gun? You unload the clip?
It was pulled back.
Okay.
I kept
Okay. And you remember that when you shot him, you kept shooting.
even after this locked up.
Even after it locked back? Okay. So you're moving your finger like you're still pulling the trigger.
And I kept going.
Okay.
When he finally started telling us the truth, it just kind of flooded out of him. You know, sometimes pushing them to that point gets those floodgates open and they just continue to talk and tell us what really happened.
He's given us a reason why. Now we have that confession, but you don't want to stop there. You still want as much information as you can get.
And had he fallen down by then? Did he have a gun? Did you see a gun in his hand? Was he doing anything to you? Did he ever touch you?
He was yelling around the car.
Okay.
And I just made it. Oh, man. I should have told my attorney that first.
So that's up to you, okay?
I should have told my attorney before I made these statements.
So his demeanor changed when he starts talking about, I just confessed, I just told you what happened. I think he's starting to understand the gravity of what's going on.
Okay, well, you've mentioned wanting an attorney, and at this point, that's your right. We're going to go ahead and step out, okay? Hang tight.
That ain't right, man. You guys can't do that. You guys play me.
The way Corey described what he had done, his confession was not 100% exactly what occurred. But he was able to give me enough detail of what he did to put himself there. So I had all the puzzle pieces together. I also had great witness statements. And I really felt like the information that I had at that moment was enough to continue on with this case to get it charged.
Mom, they can't save me this time. Stand up.
This was a successful ending, although, truly these cases have no good endings. We always try to go back and find any connection with our victim and our suspect, and there was no evidence at all during this investigation that Jackie sold anything, including bath salts, to Corey Bentley. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I find that terribly sad for him and his family.
Yeah, it's the car I drive every day. It's just something I never want to leave because it's the last thing I have from him. It's the last thing he loved. Everyone said that it was his baby. It's nothing special, but it was his. So as long as I have that vehicle, I feel like he's still here.
Jack's memory lives on. He gets to sit where his father once sat and drive that vehicle proudly, just like his father would have wanted him to. And I know he's going to go on being who his father was. He is definitely a spitting image.
It starts with a silence that shouldn't exist, the kind that settles in a city that never truly sleeps. A pause between traffic lights and late trains, between neon signs and empty sidewalks. And on a cold evening in the fall of 1999, Toronto felt that silence spread like a stain. A woman didn't come home. No call. No message. No explanation. By midnight, her apartment light was still on, her coat still on the hook, and the phone rang unanswered until it stopped ringing at all. She was 32, well known in her neighborhood, the kind of person whose face you recognized before you knew her name. She volunteered at community events, helped organize weekend markets, greeted shop owners like old friends. On that night, she had left a meeting 2 blocks from her apartment, waved goodbye under a street lamp, and vanished into a stretch of road everyone believed was safe. No scream reported. No struggle witnessed. Just absence, clean and terrifying. By morning, posters appeared on lampposts and bus stops, her photograph photocopied until the smile blurred, the edges curled. Missing. The word looked temporary then, something that would resolve itself by afternoon, by evening, by the next news cycle. Police treated it as a disappearance, not a crime. Adults vanish for reasons. Stress. Choices. That's what they said. That's what people wanted to believe. But the hours stretched. Her bank account stayed untouched. Her voicemail filled. Her sister flew in from out of town and slept on the couch, listening for footsteps that never came. Detectives canvassed the area, retraced her route, knocked on doors where lights flicked on and off like nervous eyes. No one had seen anything unusual. No one remembered a car slowing down, a voice raised, a shadow lingering too long. The street gave up nothing. 3 days later, the tone changed. A search team found her bag in a public park less than a kilometer away, placed neatly beside a bench, phone still inside, keys missing. It felt staged. Intentional. Reporters arrived, cameras framing the bench as if it might explain itself. Headlines shifted from missing woman to mysterious disappearance shocks community. The phrase cold case had not yet entered the conversation, but its shadow already loomed. The investigation widened. Friends were interviewed, co-workers questioned, acquaintances listed and relisted. She had no known enemies. No history of risky behavior. No reason to disappear. That absence of motive became its own alarm. Detectives talked about opportunity instead. About timing. About familiarity. Someone who knew the area. Someone who knew her routine. Someone who wouldn't raise suspicion simply by being there. Then came the witnesses, fragmented and unreliable. Memories shaped by fear and suggestion. A man who thought he saw her speaking to someone near a corner store. A woman who recalled footsteps behind her that night. Heavy, unhurried. A taxi driver who remembered a figure standing alone under a flickering light. Looking lost or waiting. None of it aligned cleanly. None of it held under pressure. The city remained mute. Days turned into weeks. Vigils were held. Candles burned low. Her photograph appeared on evening news segments, her name spoken with increasing gravity. Police officially acknowledged foul play without explaining why. Evidence was thin. Too thin. A few fibers on the bag. Smudged fingerprints from a park bench touched by hundreds before it was taped off. CCTV cameras existed, but in 1999 they were grainy, limited, often broken. The footage showed movement, shapes, time passing. Nothing more. Then a name surfaced, not in an arrest, not in a charge, but in a whisper. A man everyone knew. A fixture in the neighborhood. Someone who attended the same meetings, helped with the same events, shook the same hands. He had been nearby that night. That much was confirmed. He admitted it freely. He said he had spoken to her briefly, nothing unusual, nothing memorable. He smiled during the interview, relaxed, cooperative. Too cooperative, some thought. Not cooperative enough, others argued. Police brought him in again. And again. They asked about his timeline, his movements, his relationship with her. He had answers. He had alibis. He had witnesses who remembered seeing him elsewhere later that night. Nothing airtight, nothing false enough to break. His home was searched with consent. Nothing obvious found. No blood. No belongings. No trace that could anchor suspicion into proof. The community split quietly. Some defended him, citing years of trust, shared history, familiarity. Others avoided his gaze at meetings, lowered their voices when he entered a room. The idea that someone so ordinary, so embedded, could be responsible unsettled people more than the disappearance itself. Fear is easier when it has a stranger's face. As winter crept in, hope thinned. Search efforts slowed. Leads dried up. The case drifted toward that dangerous place where questions remain but momentum dies. Detectives rotated. Files grew thicker but no clearer. The woman's apartment was emptied. Her sister returned home with boxes and no answers. The bench in the park remained unremarkable again, except to those who knew. Years passed. The city changed. New buildings rose. Old shops closed. Her posters faded, replaced by advertisements and notices no one read. The case was reclassified quietly, moved to a shelf labeled cold. A word that sounded clinical but felt like abandonment. Evidence sat in storage, fibers sealed in plastic, notes written by hands that had since retired. Every so often the case resurfaced. An anonymous tip. A claimed sighting in another province. A rumor passed through online forums. Each time investigators reopened boxes, reviewed timelines, contacted the familiar man once more. Each time nothing solid emerged. He aged. So did everyone else. He remained in the community, less visible now, but still present, still ordinary. In the mid-2000s, advances in forensic science sparked renewed interest. Old evidence was tested again. Results came back inconclusive, partial, unusable. Not enough to name anyone. Not enough to clear anyone either. The frustration deepened. The case hovered in limbo, neither alive nor dead. The woman's name became shorthand among detectives, a reminder of limits. New officers learned it as a cautionary tale. Preserve everything. Assume nothing. Time is not your ally. The familiar man's name remained in the margins, circled, underlined, questioned, never crossed out. Suspicion without proof is a dangerous thing, but absence of proof is not absence of guilt. That tension never resolved. Community members still talk about that night, usually after a pause, usually in lowered voices. They describe the street as it was then, quieter, less watched. They wonder if someone could have intervened, noticed something, remembered differently. They replay ordinary moments. searching for significance that only hindsight can invent. The case remains open. Officially, unofficially it waits. For a witness who remembers. For technology that catches up. For a mistake finally made. The familiar face still walks the same streets, now just another aging resident among many. The bench still sits in the park. The silence still lingers. And somewhere in Toronto the question endures unanswered and heavy. Did the truth hide in plain sight all along? And if so, how close has it always been, watching, blending in, untouched by time? The city learned to live around the absence, stepping over it the way you step around a crack in the pavement, careful at first, then almost without noticing, until one day you realize it has shaped the way you walk. In the months after the disappearance, Toronto's routines resumed, but the rhythm was altered, conversations shortened, glances held a beat longer, and every familiar face carried an unspoken question. The case file grew heavier even as the trail went cold, pages accumulating without progress, a physical record of effort that refused to turn into answers. Detectives returned to the beginning, not because they believed they had missed something obvious, but because beginnings are the only place where hope still feels plausible. They reconstructed the last hour of her life again, minute by minute, mapping the blocks, the lighting, the gaps between cameras, the blind corners where memory gives way to speculation. They walked the route at night, listening to the city breathe, trying to imagine the soundscape as it had been in 1999. The hum of traffic, the distant voices, the moments where someone could vanish without consequence. They re-interviewed everyone. Friends, colleagues, baristas who had served her coffee that afternoon, volunteers who had sat beside her at the meeting. Each conversation added texture but not direction. People remembered her kindness, her reliability, her plans. No one remembered fear. No one recalled an argument, a threat, a warning sign. The absence of friction became its own mystery. Crimes are supposed to leave splinters. This one felt smooth, almost polished. Attention drifted back, inevitably, to the familiar man. The one whose presence had never fully receded from the margins of the case. He had aged into a different version of himself, hair thinner, posture slower, but his role in the story remained unchanged. He had been there. He had spoken to her. He had no convincing reason to remember the exchange, and no way to forget it either. Every interview reopened the same wound, for him and for the investigators who could never quite close their notebooks. They examined his timeline again, pressing on the spaces between known points. A 15-minute gap here. An unexplained detour there. Nothing illegal. Nothing provable. He passed polygraphs that were never admissible anyway. He offered DNA voluntarily, confident, almost eager, as if transparency itself might serve as armor. The results matched nothing. The evidence, already thin, grew thinner. Rumors bloomed where facts failed. Someone claimed he had once made a comment that felt off in hindsight. Someone else recalled seeing him near the park on a different night, a year earlier. A memory shaped by repetition rather than truth. Online forums amplified these fragments, weaving narratives that felt convincing because they filled the silence. Police monitored the chatter, aware of its dangers, aware also that sometimes noise carries echoes of reality. Nothing solid emerged. The case acquired a reputation within the department, not as a failure but as a test. New detectives were assigned briefly, bringing fresh eyes, then reassigned when progress stalled. Each left notes, theories, questions, their handwriting joining a palimpsest of unresolved intent. The evidence room held the physical remnants. The bag, the fibers, the photographs. Objects that had outlived their moment, and now waited for a future that refused to arrive. As years passed, technology shifted expectations. DNA analysis improved. Databases expanded. Cold cases elsewhere found resolution. Their stories splashed across headlines with triumphant language that felt almost cruel by comparison. Families called, asking why this case remained untouched by the same miracle. Detectives explained degradation, contamination, limits. Explanations that made sense intellectually but did nothing to quiet grief. The familiar man continued his life under a low hum of suspicion, never charged, never cleared. Some avoided him. Others defended him fiercely, resenting the implication that familiarity could mask violence. He withdrew from community roles, citing stress, age, disinterest. His absence from those spaces was noticed, interpreted, misinterpreted. Every change in his behavior became evidence to someone, irrelevant to someone else. The truth, if it existed, remained inaccessible. The city's memory softened but did not disappear. Anniversaries passed with brief mentions in local papers, small columns that recap the facts without adding insight. Still unsolved, they would say, as if the phrase were a destination rather than a condition. Each year, the case slipped further into history, yet refused to settle. It lingered like an unfinished sentence. A decade after the disappearance, a new lead surfaced from an unexpected place. A man in another province claimed to have overheard a confession years earlier, a drunken admission made and forgotten by everyone except him. The name he provided matched no one in the file. Investigators followed the thread anyway, traveling, interviewing, verifying. The story unraveled under scrutiny, collapsing into exaggeration and misremembered bravado. Another door closed. The family endured this cycle with a resilience that felt unnatural. They learned to hope cautiously, to grieve without resolution, to answer questions from strangers who believed curiosity was a form of concern. They kept her room intact longer than most would have, as if space itself might remember something they had forgotten. Eventually, practicality forced change. The room became storage. The silence remained. Inside the department, the case became shorthand for uncertainty. This isn't another Toronto 99, supervisors would say when cautioning against assumptions. The phrase carried weight. It reminded investigators that proximity does not equal proof, that intuition without evidence can corrode justice, as surely as indifference. The familiar man's shadow loomed over these discussions, a living example of how suspicion can persist without resolution. Years later, a partial DNA profile was extracted from one of the fibers, degraded but present. It was entered into national databases with muted expectations. No match. The absence felt heavier this time because it had arrived wrapped in hope. The science had spoken and it had said nothing. The park changed. New benches replaced old ones. Trees grew taller. The exact spot where the bag had been found blurred into general memory, known only to those who had stood there when it mattered. Joggers passed through unaware. Children played nearby. The ordinariness felt like an insult to some, a relief to others. Life insisted on continuing. The familiar man grew older, his presence less remarked upon, his story no closer to conclusion. Some wondered if time itself would solve the case, if mortality would bring confessions or clarity. Others feared the opposite, that time would erase the last living connections, sealing the truth permanently out of reach. Both possibilities coexisted, equally plausible, equally unsettling. Detectives nearing retirement revisited the file privately, flipping through pages they knew by heart, tracing patterns that had once felt promising. They considered alternative theories they had dismissed, routes they had not prioritized, biases they might not have recognized. Regret surfaced, but so did acceptance. Not every story yields its ending. The city, meanwhile, carried the case quietly, woven into its collective awareness like a low-frequency signal. People locked doors earlier, walked home together, looked twice at what once seemed benign. The disappearance had altered behavior without ever revealing its cause. Fear had outlived facts. And still, the question remained, suspended in the air between suspicion and silence, between a familiar face and an absent woman, between evidence that refuses to speak and a community that cannot forget. The case waited, unchanged, for something to shift, for time or chance or human error to finally tip the balance, leaving Toronto to wonder whether the truth, if it ever surfaced, would bring relief or only confirm what everyone had been afraid to say aloud all along. Time didn't solve the case, but it rearranged it, shifting what mattered and what could be seen, sanding down the sharp edges until only the most stubborn questions remained. By the early 2010s, the file had become an artifact of endurance, its weight less about pages than about years. New leadership rotated in, bringing with it a mandate that sounded simple and felt impossible. Look again, but look differently. The order wasn't about chasing ghosts. It was about interrogating assumptions, especially the comfortable ones. The first assumption to be challenged was the timeline. Not the official version, but the version everyone had learned to accept because it was neat. Detectives rebuilt it without anchors, stripping away statements that had hardened into fact through repetition, rather than verification. They noticed how often certainty had been borrowed from familiarity. A witness said they saw her at a certain time because they always did. Another remembered a greeting that felt routine, not specific. Habit had masqueraded as memory, and memory had been treated like evidence. They widened the window. The last confirmed sighting moved backward, then forward, then hovered uncertainly between 2 points that no longer aligned. The gap grew. Gaps invite imagination, but they also invite opportunity. The investigation leaned into that discomfort, mapping alternative paths she could have taken, reasons she might have deviated, moments when someone else's plan could have intersected with hers. The city, when seen this way, felt different. Not safe or unsafe, just porous. Attention returned inevitably to the familiar man, but with a different posture. Not accusation, examination. His statements were laid out chronologically, not to catch him in a lie, but to understand consistency. Where he added detail, where he glossed over, where his language shifted from specific to vague. Patterns emerged, subtle and arguable, the kind that never survive a courtroom but can change how a narrative feels. He had remembered peripheral things clearly: weather, lighting, the mood of the meeting. But when it came to the exact end of the interaction, his memory thinned. He always placed the goodbye in the same spot. Always the same phrasing. Always the same certainty. It read rehearsed or it read preserved depending on your lens. They compared his account to others. Small discrepancies surfaced, not damning but persistent. A door he said was open that others remembered closed. A route he claimed to take that didn't match traffic patterns that night. Individually meaningless. Collectively unsettling. The kind of unease that doesn't accuse but refuses to relax. For years, the lack of physical evidence had insulated him. That insulation began to thin as technology crept forward. Not dramatically, but steadily. The degraded fiber that had yielded nothing before was retested with updated methods. This time the result was different, not conclusive, but promising enough to justify a broader search. A partial genetic profile emerged, incomplete, anonymous, but undeniably human. It was entered again, cross-referenced, allowed to drift through expanding databases like a message in a bottle. Nothing came back. Again. The disappointment was familiar, but the process had done something else. It had reopened the file in a way that demanded accountability. Every assumption now had to defend itself. Every exclusion had to be justified. The familiar man's earlier DNA submission was revisited, not to challenge its validity, but to question the context. Had it been complete? Had it been handled properly? Chain of custody records were reviewed with forensic scrutiny. No errors surfaced. No shortcuts. The science once more refused to point. The community felt the renewed attention. Old names resurfaced in conversations. People who had moved away were contacted, surprised to hear voices from a past they had assumed was sealed. Some cooperated eagerly. Others hesitated, wary of reopening wounds. Memory had calcified. Stories had been told so often they felt true even when they conflicted. Detectives learned to listen for tone as much as content, for what people emphasized and what they avoided. One interview shifted the temperature. A former colleague, someone who had never been central to the case, mentioned a moment that had seemed trivial at the time. A comment made by the familiar man weeks before the disappearance. A joke maybe. A complaint. Something about being overlooked. About people taking advantage of kindness. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even clearly about her. But it added color where there had been only outline. Motive remained elusive, but motive is often constructed backward, shaped to fit conclusions rather than illuminate them. Investigators resisted the urge. They turned instead to behavior after the fact. The familiar man had altered his routine subtly in the months following the disappearance. He avoided certain streets. He stopped attending meetings abruptly. He gave reasons that made sense on their own. Stress, fatigue, privacy. But behavior, like memory, accumulates meaning over time. The pattern suggested withdrawal, not guilt necessarily, but response. Response to what was unclear. Financial records were re-examined. Phone logs revisited with software that could extract more than before. The night in question yielded a brief call placed from a public phone several blocks away. A call that had never been tied to anyone. The duration was short. The recipient unknown. The timing sat awkwardly in the expanded timeline. It didn't prove anything. It refused to disappear. The familiar man was interviewed again, this time with a tone that was neither friendly nor hostile, just patient. He answered as he always had. Calm. Cooperative. When asked about the call, he shrugged. He didn't remember. It could have been anyone. Public phones were common then. The response was reasonable. Too reasonable. Or maybe that was projection. The line between intuition and bias blurred dangerously. Years passed within the investigation without public notice. The case moved in increments too small for headlines. Detectives changed again. Some retired. Others took the file with them mentally, unable to let it rest. The family aged. The sister who had slept on the couch now spoke with a practiced steadiness, her hope no longer sharp but persistent. She asked the same question every time. Is there anything new? The answer was almost always no. Almost. Then the landscape shifted in a way no one had predicted. A distant case, unrelated in geography and era, was solved using genetic genealogy, a method that had once felt speculative now proving decisive. The news rippled through law enforcement quietly at first, then with urgency. If it could work there, why not here? The partial profile from Toronto 1999 was incomplete, but perhaps not unusable. Perhaps the bottle could reach a shore no one had considered. Legal hurdles were navigated carefully. Ethical questions debated. The decision was not rushed. When approval came, it arrived without ceremony. The profile was uploaded into a broader genealogical framework, not searching for a suspect, but for relatives, for connections, for echoes. Weeks passed, then months. Then a notification arrived that did not name a person, but a family tree, a distant cousin, a branch, possibility. Investigators traced it slowly, methodically, cross-referencing ages, locations, histories. The web narrowed. Names emerged. Lives overlapped. And at the center of the narrowing circle was a name already written in the file, already circled, already familiar. The familiar man had relatives in the database. Not close, distant enough to feel coincidental. But coincidence loses its innocence when it repeats. The probability shifted. Not to certainty. Not yet. But to something heavier than suspicion. Something that demanded action. Surveillance resumed, discreet and lawful. Patterns were observed. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic. Just the ordinariness of a life lived under a microscope. Trash was collected. Coffee cups. A discarded tissue. Items no one thinks about once they leave the hand. The kind of evidence time had finally made possible. The waiting returned, thicker now, charged with implication. Detectives knew better than to celebrate. DNA can open doors. Can also close them permanently. The lab processed the samples with a caution born of history. Every step documented. Every result verified. When the call came, it was quiet. No announcement. No raised voices. A match. Not partial. Not ambiguous. Statistically overwhelming. The familiar man's DNA aligned with the degraded fiber preserved for more than a decade. The silence that followed was not relief. It was gravity. The city didn't know yet. The family didn't know yet. But the case, long suspended between questions, had shifted. The truth, patient and unyielding, had finally leaned forward. The confirmation didn't arrive with sirens or celebration. It arrived like a weight placed carefully on a table, heavy enough to bend the surface but not crack it. A fact so dense it demanded silence. The DNA match existed now, undeniable statistical language standing in for certainty where years of intuition had failed. Detectives sat with it, reread it, checked it again, not because they doubted the science, but because they understood what it would do once released into the world. A familiar face was about to fracture into something else, and nothing would put it back together. Procedure took over. It always does when emotion threatens to outrun judgment. Warrants were drafted with precision, every word measured, every inference tethered to fact. Supervisors reviewed timelines not to relive them, but to ensure the narrative would withstand pressure. Prosecutors were briefed early, their questions sharp, their skepticism necessary. One match was powerful, but power without context is fragile. They needed corroboration. They needed the story to hold. The familiar man went about his routine unaware, or pretending to be. Surveillance noted the mundane details. The time he left his apartment, the cafe he favored, the way he paused at crosswalks. There was nothing in his behavior that betrayed panic or guilt, nothing cinematic. If anything, he seemed lighter, as if the years of quiet suspicion had numbed him to the possibility of consequence. Or perhaps he had always believed this moment would never come. Investigators moved carefully, collecting what time had made accessible. More discarded items. More samples. Each one returned the same answer, tightening the circle until it became inescapable. The partial profile from the fiber, once a whisper, now had a voice. The park bench, the bag, the years in storage all converged into a single line of attribution. The case, cold for so long, had warmed abruptly, and the heat was dangerous. They prepared the arrest with restraint. No spectacle. No press alerts. Just a quiet plan executed early in the morning when the city was still negotiating with daylight. He answered the door in a robe, surprised but composed, eyes scanning faces he recognized. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He seemed to understand, or perhaps he always had. The handcuffs clicked with a sound that felt too small for the moment they marked. At the station, the interview room felt unchanged, a neutral space that had absorbed decades of other confessions and denials. He sat across from detectives who had imagined this scene for years without believing it would happen. The tone was calm, respectful. They laid out the evidence slowly, not as an accusation, but as an invitation to respond. The DNA, the timeline, the inconsistencies, the call from the public phone. Each piece placed deliberately, like stepping stones across a river that had once been impassable. He listened. He nodded. He asked for water. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost instructional, as if explaining something to someone who needed help understanding. He denied nothing directly, but he denied responsibility through distance, through reframing, through the careful erosion of specificity. He spoke about stress in 1999, about feeling invisible, about moments that spiral when no one is watching. He never used her name. That omission was noted. Hours passed. The interview did not end in a confession. Didn't need to. The case no longer required one. Silence had lost its power. When he was charged, the paperwork was thick with years, the language precise enough to carry them. He was led away without drama, his face already becoming a photograph that would circulate, annotated with words like suspect and arrested, labels that arrive late but stick hard. The news broke cautiously, then all at once. Headlines struggled to contain the contradiction. Community fixture, longtime volunteer, charged in decades-old disappearance. The phrase cold case solved appeared everywhere, sometimes celebrated, sometimes questioned. Shock rippled outward, not loud but deep, unsettling assumptions people hadn't known they carried. Familiarity, it turned out, was not a safeguard. The family received the call before the press. The sister listened, asked questions, took notes she didn't need. She thanked the detective and sat in silence afterward, the room unchanged, the answer present at last but not transforming the air the way she had imagined. Closure is a word people use when they want an ending. This felt more like punctuation. Court proceedings began with the weight of history pressing against every motion. Defense attorneys challenged the DNA, the collection methods, the genealogical process that had led to their client. Experts testified with diagrams and probabilities, translating science into language meant to persuade without overwhelming. The prosecution laid out the narrative carefully, resisting the urge to dramatize. The facts were enough. The years did their own work. Witnesses returned to rooms they had hoped never to see again. Memories were tested, cross-examined, exposed to doubt. Some held. Some cracked. The timeline, once so uncertain, aligned just enough to carry meaning. The public phone call found its place. The altered routines acquired context. The jury listened, aware that they were not just judging a man, but a past that had waited a long time to be heard. Outside, the community reeled. Meetings were canceled. Apologies were issued for things no one could articulate. People searched their memories for signs they might have missed, moments that felt different now under new light. Some defended him still, unable to reconcile the man they knew with the evidence presented. Others felt betrayed, angry not only at him, but at themselves for trusting ease over caution. The park became a point of pilgrimage again. Flowers appeared briefly, then disappeared. The bench was photographed, written about, argued over. It looked the same. Objects often do when meaning changes faster than material. The city learned again that places can carry more than they show. When the verdict came, it arrived without flourish. Guilty. The word landed and stayed. There was no collective gasp, no cinematic release. Just a long exhale that sounded different depending on who you asked. The familiar man stood, expression unreadable, and was led away, his role in the community receding into a footnote attached to a darker headline. Sentencing followed, measured and severe. The judge spoke about time, about patience, about the persistence of truth. The sentence acknowledged years lost without pretending they could be returned. Justice delayed, made no promises beyond accountability. Afterward, the city settled into a new quiet. Not the silence of uncertainty, but the quieter, heavier hush of recognition. The case was solved, yes, but its solution didn't erase the years it had shaped. It added to them. It demanded a recalibration of trust, of memory, of how well anyone can know the spaces they inhabit. The family held a small gathering. No cameras, no statements. Just people who had carried absence long enough to feel its weight change. They spoke her name freely now, not as a question but as a fact. The room felt fuller than it had in years. The file was closed officially, stamped and archived, but it continued to live elsewhere, in training manuals, in lectures, in the cautious optimism of detectives who would face their own long waits. The Toronto 1999 cold case had ended, but its echo persisted, a reminder that time can hide truth, but it can also preserve it, waiting for the moment when the familiar finally becomes unmistakable. The verdict did not end the story. It altered its gravity. Once the courtroom emptied and the cameras drifted away, the case moved into a quieter phase where consequences unfolded without spectacle. Toronto adjusted to a truth that felt both overdue and destabilizing, as if the city had finally identified a hairline fracture running through years of ordinary life. Conversations softened. People chose words more carefully. The solved cold case became a reference point, not for fear, but for reconsideration. In the weeks following sentencing, institutions began their own audits, the kind that rarely make headlines but shape futures. Evidence storage protocols were reviewed with renewed seriousness. Boxes once treated as static were reimagined as promises to the future, obligations rather than leftovers. The Toronto 1999 file became a training exemplar, its margins annotated not with blame, but with questions. What was preserved? What nearly wasn't? What assumptions slowed the work? The answers mattered because they traveled outward, influencing cases that had yet to be born. For the investigators who had carried the case through its final stretch, the aftermath was oddly disorienting. Purpose had sustained them. Resolution required recalibration. Some felt relief sharpened by fatigue. Others felt a low hum of unease, the knowledge that certainty had arrived too late to restore what had been taken. They spoke about the case less now, not because it hurt, but because it had become integrated, folded into their professional identities like a scar that no longer aches but never disappears. The community faced its own reckoning. Meetings resumed with an altered tone, agendas trimmed, side conversations subdued. The familiar man's name was no longer spoken with ambiguity. It carried a fixed weight. People revisited memories, searching for clarity that hindsight pretends to offer. They wondered how many times they had mistaken proximity for safety, friendliness for transparency. Trust did not collapse. It reorganized, informed by a recognition that harm does not always announce itself. Media coverage evolved, too. Early headlines had emphasized shock, the reversal of expectation. Later pieces examined process, tracing how patience and restraint had outperformed certainty and speed. Long-form articles mapped the case's journey across decades, highlighting not the criminal's actions but the system's capacity to learn. This shift was not altruistic. It was corrective. The story demanded a lens that could hold complexity without sensationalism. The family navigated a complicated relief. Grief did not end, it changed shape. The sister described it as a pressure that finally had a direction. She no longer woke to questions without answers, but answers without comfort. There were legal matters to resolve, personal rituals to complete, spaces to reclaim. They held a memorial not to reopen wounds, but to close a chapter that had never been allowed an ending. Names were spoken, photographs displayed. The absence was acknowledged, not denied. The city's legal apparatus absorbed the case into precedent. Motions cited its evidentiary pathway. Judges referenced its careful use of genetic genealogy as an example of proportionality, not opportunism. The case helped refine standards for when and how emerging technologies could be applied to dormant investigations. It became a guardrail, a reminder that innovation must be accompanied by oversight, patience, and respect for boundaries. Defense counsel, too, reflected publicly, a rare but necessary contribution. They spoke about the tension between protecting rights and confronting truth, about how the passage of time complicates fairness, even as it enables discovery. Their commentary added dimension to the narrative, emphasizing that justice is not a zero-sum equation, but a balance that must be recalculated as tools evolve. Within academic circles, the case prompted renewed study of memory. Psychologists examined witness statements that had hardened over time, exploring how repetition and community narrative can reshape recollection. The findings filtered back into investigative training, reinforcing practices that separate memory from evidence without dismissing either. Toronto 1999 became a case where learning did not end with resolution. The park where the bag had been found underwent subtle changes. No plaques, no official marker, just a redesign that improved lighting and sightlines, framed as a safety initiative rather than a memorial. Residents noticed. Some appreciated the discretion. Others wished for acknowledgement. The city chose function over symbolism, a decision that reflected its broader response. Move forward without erasing what happened. The familiar man's former spaces emptied quietly. His apartment was cleared by court order, its contents catalogued and dispersed. Neighbors avoided eye contact when the door was finally sealed, unsure whether to feel relief or grief for a version of reality that had vanished. The ordinariness of the space felt unsettling, a reminder that environments do not reveal the lives lived within them. As months passed, the case's echo reached other jurisdictions. Cold case units requested briefings, not to replicate details but to understand cadence. How long to wait before retesting? When to expand scope? How to communicate with families across decades without inflating hope? Toronto's experience became guidance, offered with humility rather than prescription. Technological conversations intensified. Genetic genealogy was debated in public forums, its promise weighed against privacy concerns. The Toronto case was cited frequently, sometimes accurately, sometimes selectively. Officials emphasized context, consent frameworks, judicial oversight, narrow application. The nuance mattered. The goal was not to normalize intrusion, but to demonstrate restraint. The cultural impact surfaced in unexpected places. Writers referenced the case obliquely in fiction, using it to explore themes of familiarity and concealment. Visual artists created installations about time and evidence, inspired by the idea that truth can be preserved quietly. None used names. The influence was atmospheric, diffused through creative expression, rather than explicit retelling. Within law enforcement, the case altered how success was measured. Clearance rates mattered less than integrity metrics. Preservation audits gained prominence. Cold cases were reframed as living responsibilities rather than static failures. This shift did not solve everything, but it changed incentives, which in turn changed behavior. The family found moments of peace that had once felt impossible. They reclaimed routines without the constant pull of uncertainty. Holidays carried different weight. The sister spoke publicly once, briefly, to thank those who had not given up. She did not speak about forgiveness or closure. She spoke about persistence, about the quiet labor of keeping a question alive without letting it consume everything else. As the first anniversary of the verdict approached, media interest flickered and dimmed. The story had entered its long tail, where meaning accrues without attention. That was appropriate. The case had always been about endurance more than drama. In classrooms, instructors asked students to consider what would have happened if evidence had been discarded, if assumptions had gone unchallenged, if technology had been used recklessly rather than carefully. The hypotheticals sharpened appreciation for the choices made, the delays tolerated, the patience required. Toronto 1999 became a lesson not in inevitability, but in stewardship. The city, meanwhile, continued. Streets filled. Meetings convened. New faces joined communities that had learned, perhaps unconsciously, to look beyond surfaces. The solved cold case did not make Toronto safer overnight, but it made it more attentive. Awareness replaced complacency. Caution replaced certainty. In private moments, investigators sometimes revisited the file not to reopen it but to understand it as a whole. They saw the arcs now, the inflection points, the moments when things could have gone differently. This retrospective clarity was both instructive and humbling. It reinforced a truth the case had taught repeatedly. Progress is rarely linear, and resolution is often the product of refusal rather than brilliance. As Part 5 settles, the narrative stands less as a triumph and more as a transformation. The Toronto 1999 cold case is solved, yes, but its resolution radiates outward, reshaping practices, perceptions, and priorities. It leaves behind not a sense of finality, but a quieter commitment to care, to patience, to the belief that even when answers take decades, the work of preserving them is never wasted. The case, now officially closed, did not fade into stillness. It redistributed its energy, flowing into places where policy is written, where memory is formalized, where future decisions are quietly shaped. Toronto carried the solved cold case like a newly calibrated instrument, sensitive to pressures it once ignored. The city's institutions learned to listen differently, attuned to signals that had always been there but rarely amplified. Inside precincts, the file became a living document. Not a trophy, not a cautionary tale, but a reference that invited interrogation. Supervisors asked teams to reconstruct the decision points that had slowed progress, and those that had preserved possibility. They traced how early classifications influence resource allocation, how language shapes urgency, how familiarity can dull scrutiny. The exercise was uncomfortable by design. Comfort had never helped this case. Cold case units expanded their remit, shifting from reactive review to proactive stewardship. Evidence audits were scheduled, not in response to crises but as routine practice. Storage facilities were upgraded. Digital indexing replaced handwritten logs that once relied on institutional memory. The Toronto case justified budgets that had long struggled for approval, not through spectacle, but through proof that patience, resourced correctly, can yield truth. Training changed tone. New recruits learned the mechanics of scene control and witness interviewing alongside lessons in humility. Instructors emphasized that certainty is a feeling, not a fact, and that feelings age poorly. The familiar man's trajectory was discussed obliquely, stripped of name and sensational detail, framed instead as an example of how proximity can camouflage risk and how restraint can keep doors open long enough for science to catch up. Prosecutorial offices engaged in parallel reflection. The case reinforced the value of charging decisions that wait for sufficiency rather than momentum. Attorneys revisited guidelines for long-dormant cases, refining thresholds for action and disclosure. They acknowledged the strain on witnesses whose memories must perform under scrutiny decades later, and they refined strategies to protect integrity without erasing human variability. The Toronto verdict strengthened their resolve to proceed only when narratives could withstand time as well as cross-examination. The judiciary absorbed the case in subtler ways. Continuing education seminars referenced it when discussing emerging forensic methods and their admissibility. Judges debated the ethics of delayed evidence collection, the balance between innovation and intrusion. The consensus was not celebratory. It was careful. The case had succeeded not because boundaries were ignored, but because they were navigated deliberately. Public discourse matured in response. Community forums shifted from fear-driven questions to structural ones. Residents asked how evidence is kept, how decisions are reviewed, how accountability persists when attention fades. City officials responded with transparency measures that would have seemed radical years earlier. Reports were published, processes explained, limitations admitted. Trust grew not from certainty but from candor. The family continued to chart their own course through a landscape that now included answers. They declined invitations to become symbols. They chose privacy with intention, speaking publicly only when it served a purpose they recognized. In interviews, the sister emphasized the long view, the importance of systems that endure beyond individual cases. Her restraint set a tone that shaped coverage and conversation alike. Media organizations adjusted editorial practices, guided by lessons learned the hard way. Sensational framing gave way to process-driven storytelling. Reporters invested time in understanding chain of custody and statistical thresholds, explaining them without diluting complexity. The Toronto case became a benchmark for responsible coverage of cold case resolutions, cited in internal memos in journalism schools as an example of how to balance public interest with ethical care. Academic research flourished around the case's implications. Scholars published analyses on delayed justice, examining how prolonged uncertainty affects communities differently than unresolved cases. Findings suggested that resolution, even after decades, recalibrates social trust in ways that defy simple metrics. The Toronto outcome supported a nuanced view. Closure is not an endpoint but a transition that redistributes emotional labor across institutions and individuals. The park's redesign matured into a broader urban safety initiative. Improved lighting extended to adjacent blocks. Sightlines were cleared. Maintenance schedules tightened. These changes were framed as infrastructure, not memorialization, reflecting a philosophy that honors victims through prevention rather than commemoration alone. Residents noticed the difference not as a reminder of tragedy, but as a subtle ease when moving through shared space. Elsewhere in the city, other cold cases received renewed attention, not all with the same result. Some advanced, others remained dormant. The Toronto 1999 case did not promise universality, it promised possibility. It encouraged departments to invest in readiness rather than outcomes, to preserve even when payoff was uncertain. This shift was quiet but consequential. Technologists engaged with law enforcement to refine tools used in genealogical analysis. Consent frameworks were clarified. Oversight mechanisms strengthened. The case demonstrated that precision and restraint are not opposites, that careful application enhances legitimacy. International collaborations emerged, sharing protocols rather than data, ensuring methods traveled without compromising local norms. Defense advocacy groups also found voice, emphasizing safeguards that protect against overreach. They acknowledged the Toronto result, while insisting that success does not absolve risk. Their participation enriched the dialogue, reinforcing a shared commitment to fairness. The case became a platform for balance rather than polarization. Within neighborhoods, social dynamics adjusted in small ways. People were slower to assign character based on familiarity alone. Volunteer organizations updated screening practices, not out of suspicion but out of responsibility. Trust was rebuilt with structure, a recognition that good intentions benefit from verification. The familiar man's absence settled into a different kind of presence. His former roles were redistributed. The spaces he once occupied filled with new volunteers who carried the weight of awareness without fear. The community learned that continuity does not require denial, that moving forward can coexist with clear-eyed acknowledgement. At conferences and workshops, presenters returned to a single theme: stewardship. The idea that justice is not a sprint but a relay, passed between hands that may never meet. The Toronto case illustrated how early diligence preserved late opportunity, how choices made without applause can matter most when time stretches long. Investigators from other cities visited Toronto to observe operations shaped by the case. They asked about morale, about patience, about managing expectations with families. The answers were candid. There were no shortcuts, only habits, only care. The family's private rituals evolved. Anniversaries were marked with intention rather than dread. The sister described learning to carry memory without being carried by it. She spoke of gratitude not as forgiveness, but as relief that persistence had been honored. The distinction mattered. In classrooms, students debated counterfactuals. What if the evidence had been discarded? What if suspicion had hardened into accusation without proof? What if technology had arrived sooner or later? These exercises sharpened appreciation for contingency, for the idea that outcomes depend on sequences of choices, rather than inevitability. The city's archives curated the case with restraint. Exhibits emphasized process and uncertainty, not spectacle. Visitors encountered timelines that highlighted pauses and reversals, teaching that progress often arrives obliquely. The design invited reflection rather than consumption. As months turned into years, the case's influence stabilized. It became background knowledge, embedded in practice rather than invoked by name. That was its success. When lessons outgrow labels, they endure. Part 6 settles into this quiet aftershock, where resolution's true work begins. The Toronto 1999 cold case did not end with a verdict. It entered a longer chapter of application and care. Its legacy is not a single answer, but a discipline. Preserve, question, wait, and act only when the truth, patient and prepared, is ready to be heard. What lingered after policy shifts and procedural reforms was something less measurable. A change in how people inhabited uncertainty. Toronto did not become a city obsessed with its past. It became a city attentive to its margins. The solved cold case reframed waiting not as neglect, but as vigilance sustained without spectacle. In that space, quieter transformations took hold. Investigators who had cut their teeth on the case found themselves mentoring with a different cadence. They taught patience as a skill, not a personality trait. They demonstrated how to document uncertainty without surrendering to it, how to keep questions alive without letting them metastasize into assumptions. In briefings, they emphasized the discipline of not knowing, the craft of leaving doors open. The Toronto file was rarely mentioned by name. Its influence traveled through habits. The family's relationship with institutions matured into collaboration. They participated in advisory panels when asked, not to revisit pain but to advocate for endurance. They spoke about cadence, about how families need communication that respects time rather than chases hope. Their presence reshaped protocols for cold case outreach, replacing sporadic updates with steady contact that did not inflate expectations. The effect was subtle but profound. Trust grew in the absence of promises. Within the courts, appellate discussions touched the case obliquely, parsing standards that had been stress-tested by decades. Opinions referenced the careful layering of evidence, the restraint exercised before arrest, the avoidance of narrative shortcuts. The language was precise, almost spare. It conveyed a judiciary aware that legitimacy is earned not only by outcomes, but by the paths taken to reach them. Journalism schools integrated the case into curricula focused on long-form responsibility. Students examined early coverage and later retrospectives, tracing how framing evolves with understanding. They learned to distinguish between urgency and haste, between public interest and public appetite. The Toronto story taught that patience can be reported, that the slow arc of a case can be rendered compelling without distortion. This recalibration affected how future investigations would be told. The community organizations once anchored by the familiar man reorganized without fanfare. New leaders emerged. Roles were redistributed. Screening practices were refined. The changes were not punitive, they were procedural. Volunteers accepted them as a form of collective care, an acknowledgement that good intentions benefit from structure. The city learned to fortify trust rather than assume it. In neighborhoods adjacent to the park, residents noticed the difference in how they moved through shared space. Lighting and design mattered, but so did awareness. People walked together more often, checked in with neighbors, noticed patterns without succumbing to paranoia. Safety became relational rather than reactive. The case had taught that vigilance is most effective when shared. Cold case units across the country continued to call, to visit, to observe. They wanted to know how Toronto sustained momentum without burning out. The answer, repeated in different forms, was rhythm. Work in cycles. Review without urgency. Preserve without expectation. Act when readiness aligns. The philosophy resisted replication as a checklist. It required cultural buy-in. Some jurisdictions embraced it. Others struggled. The Toronto case did not judge. It offered. Technological oversight boards refined their charters. Genetic genealogy, once novel, now required clear thresholds and sunset clauses. The case had demonstrated efficacy under constraint. It also revealed the importance of consent and transparency. Oversight became a feature, not a break. Public briefings explained methods in plain language, reducing mystique and building understanding. Trust followed clarity. Defense communities engaged in ongoing dialogue, emphasizing the need for guardrails that travel with tools. They pointed to the Toronto process as evidence that restraint does not weaken cases. It strengthens them. Their advocacy ensured that success would not become license. The balance held, precarious but deliberate. For the investigators most closely involved, the years after resolution brought unexpected moments of reckoning. Some found themselves restless, the absence of an unresolved question creating space they had not anticipated. Others experienced delayed emotion, the weight of years surfacing once the work no longer demanded suppression. Departments responded with support structures that recognized closure as a transition rather than an endpoint. The family's private life continued to open. They reclaimed rooms and routines that had been paused for decades. They allowed laughter to coexist with memory without apology. The sister described learning to plan without the asterisk of uncertainty, to imagine futures unshadowed by unanswered questions. This recalibration was gradual, earned, and deeply personal. Cultural responses to the case matured into restraint. Artists and writers referenced it sparingly, focusing on themes rather than retelling facts. The story became a lens through which to explore time, patience, and the ethics of waiting. Its power lay in implication, not repetition. The city recognized itself in these reflections, not as a place of spectacle, but as a community capable of care. Municipal leaders used the case to justify investments in records management and archival integrity. The argument was practical. Information preserved is opportunity preserved. Budgets reflected this logic, funding not only hardware but training and redundancy. The work was invisible to most residents, which was precisely the point. Preparedness does not require applause. International exchanges continued, with Toronto hosting delegations interested in process rather than tactics. Conversations centered on governance, consent, and sustainability. The case illustrated that methods divorced from values are brittle. The lesson traveled well. Within police academies, instructors emphasized the difference between confidence and certainty. Recruits learned to articulate doubt without losing authority, to document ambiguity without surrendering resolve. Exercises included long timelines, asking trainees to imagine how today's choices might read decades later. The Toronto file hovered in the background, shaping the exercise without naming itself. The park, now ordinary again, hosted small scenes of daily life that felt newly precious. Parents watched children with a different awareness, not fear-driven but attentive. The bench remained unmarked, a deliberate choice that honored memory without freezing space. Life continued, which was both a comfort and a testament. The familiar man's name receded into legal records and footnotes. The community resisted the urge to mythologize, to explain the inexplicable through caricature. This refusal was intentional. It kept the focus where it belonged, on systems, on care, on the conditions that allow truth to surface without granting notoriety. As years accumulated after resolution, the case's influence stabilized into practice. It informed how files were kept, how families were contacted, how technology was governed. It became background radiation, always present, rarely noticed. This was the mark of its success. In reflective moments, investigators described the case as teaching them how to wait without wasting time. The phrase circulated, precise and paradoxical. Waiting, they learned, can be active. Preservation is action. Documentation is action. Restraint is action. The Toronto 1999 cold case embodied this ethic. The city's relationship with its own memory softened. It did not cling to the case as identity, it integrated it as experience. Schools discussed it briefly in civics units about institutions and accountability. Students learned that justice can be delayed without being denied, but only if care is sustained. The lesson landed quietly. Families affected by other unresolved cases reached out, finding in the Toronto story a cautious hope that did not promise outcomes. Support networks expanded, sharing strategies for endurance rather than timelines for resolution. The case had taught that hope is most resilient when it is patient. As Part 7 settles, the narrative inhabits a mature phase where impact is measured not by headlines but by habits. The solved cold case continues to shape Toronto through choices made daily, often invisibly. Its legacy is discipline, not drama. Stewardship, not spectacle. And in that disciplined quiet, the city carries forward a truth learned the hard way. That waiting, when done with care, can be a form of justice. With time, the solved case shed its immediacy and assumed a different shape, one defined by diffusion rather than focus. Its influence spread laterally, seeping into practices and perceptions that had nothing to do with Toronto on the surface, yet carried its imprint nonetheless. The city did not commemorate the case with monuments or anniversaries. It allowed the lessons to metabolize, to become instinct. This quiet absorption proved more durable than ceremony. In evidence facilities, technicians handled boxes with a slightly altered reverence. Labels were checked twice. Seals were inspected with patience that bordered on ritual. The Toronto file had taught them that preservation is a form of respect, not just for potential outcomes, but for the people whose lives intersect with the contents. Items once dismissed as marginal were reclassified as latent, capable of speaking when the language evolved. The future, it turned out, depended on how the present treated the past. Data governance became a focal point. Systems designed to index and retrieve information were stress-tested against decades-long horizons. Redundancy was no longer an inefficiency. It was resilience. The Toronto case, featured in white papers and procurement meetings, cited not for its drama, but for its demands. How do you build systems that assume patience? How do you fund care that may never be publicly rewarded? These questions reshaped priorities. The courts continued to refine doctrine around delayed justice. Judges wrote opinions that emphasized proportionality and caution, mindful that powerful tools require narrow gates. The Toronto pathway, layered, audited, restrained, served as a reference for what legitimacy looks like when time stretches. The message was clear. Success does not excuse shortcuts, it condemns them. For the prosecutors who had carried the case through trial, the aftermath included an unexpected clarity. They spoke candidly about the relief of no longer carrying a secret, about the responsibility of shaping a narrative that could withstand both scrutiny and restraint. They resisted the temptation to cast themselves as heroes. The work, they insisted, was collective, cumulative, and often invisible. This humility recalibrated internal cultures that had once prized speed over stewardship. Defense practitioners found their advocacy sharpened, not blunted, by the case. They used Toronto as evidence that rights-respecting processes can still produce decisive outcomes. In seminars, they argued that the case demonstrated the value of skepticism, of forcing the state to earn every inference. Their participation sustained balance, ensuring that the lessons traveled with guardrails intact. The family's presence in the public sphere receded further, not out of fatigue but intention. They declined invitations that felt extractive. When they spoke, it was to advocate for preservation funding, for communication standards that treat families as partners rather than audiences. Their measured voice influenced policy in ways louder appeals could not. It reminded institutions that endurance is relational. Community memory reorganized itself around the case without fixating on it. Residents told the story to newcomers in fragments, not as warning but as context. The emphasis shifted from fear to process. How things are handled, how long questions can live, how answers arrive. This reframing reduced sensationalism while preserving significance. It allowed the city to remember without reliving. Education absorbed the case across disciplines. In public administration programs, students examined how governance choices affect outcomes decades later. In information science courses, the Toronto file illustrated metadata's moral dimension. In psychology, it anchored discussions of memory drift and narrative consolidation. The case's versatility made it a durable teaching tool, not because it was exceptional, but because it was instructive. Technology vendors responded to demand shaped by the case's lessons. Products emphasized auditability and consent over speed. Marketing language softened, prioritizing accuracy and governance. Toronto's experience had made clear that tools must serve processes, not the reverse. This recalibration influenced procurement decisions beyond the city, nudging an industry toward restraint. The park's ordinariness returned fully, a sign of healing that some initially resisted. Over time, the absence of markers felt appropriate. The space belonged to the living, shaped by use rather than memory alone. Safety improvements blended into daily routines, their origins forgotten by many, their benefits quietly enjoyed. The city chose continuity over sanctification. The familiar man's case entered its post-conviction phase, where appeals and procedural reviews tested the robustness of the path taken. Each challenge was met with documentation accumulated patiently over years. The record held. This durability reinforced confidence not in outcomes alone, but in method. It demonstrated that careful work ages well. International observers continued to cite Toronto in discussions about cold case ethics. not as a template to be copied wholesale but as an argument for readiness. The principle resonated. Preserve first, decide later. Let evidence mature. Resist the urge to compress time to fit attention spans. These ideas traveled farther than any headline. Within police culture, a subtle shift occurred around recognition. Commendations increasingly honored teams rather than individuals, preservation rather than closure. The Toronto case had shown that the most consequential actions often lack immediacy. This change did not erase ambition. It redirected it toward endurance. The family marked personal milestones without the constant interruption of speculation. Birthdays and holidays took on a steadiness that had been absent for decades. The sister described learning to hold memory without guarding it, to let joy arrive without guilt. Her language influenced support networks, offering a vocabulary for life after resolution that did not demand erasure of the past. The media's relationship with the case settled into equilibrium. Occasional retrospectives focused on systems and lessons rather than personalities. Editors resisted anniversary-driven coverage, recognizing that repetition without insight dilutes meaning. When the case was referenced, it was usually as context for broader discussions about evidence and ethics. The story had matured. Archivists curated the file with an eye toward future readers. Exhibits emphasized decision points and uncertainty, inviting visitors to consider how they would have acted with incomplete information. This approach honored complexity and discouraged hindsight bias. The Toronto case became a mirror rather than a script. As years accumulated, the case's influence manifested most clearly in what did not happen. Evidence was not discarded. Families were not forgotten. Technologies were not deployed recklessly. These absences marked progress. They reflected a discipline learned the long way. Cold case units reported steadier morale, not because outcomes improved universally but because purpose clarified. Teams understood their work as custodial, not merely investigative. This framing reduced burnout and fostered continuity. Toronto's experience had normalized the idea that waiting can be active, that care itself is labor. Public trust, fragile by nature, found firmer footing in transparency. Regular reports detailed how evidence is stored, how decisions are reviewed, how oversight functions. Residents engaged with these materials not as critics but as stakeholders. The Toronto case had invited them into the process without promising spectacle. The city's identity adjusted slightly, in ways difficult to quantify. There was a sense that institutions could learn, that patience could pay dividends without compromising rights. This confidence was quiet, not triumphant. It expressed itself in civic participation and measured expectations. As Part 8 settles, the narrative occupies a reflective plateau. The Toronto 1999 cold case no longer demands attention. It offers guidance. Its power lies in the accumulation of small, careful choices made without assurance of reward. The case teaches that justice, when treated as a long craft rather than a short sprint, can survive time's erosion. The city carries forward a discipline forged by waiting. Preserve what you cannot yet use. Question what feels obvious. Act only when readiness aligns with restraint. In this ethic, the solved case finds its lasting voice, not in headlines, but in habits that endure long after the echo fades. Years after the verdict, the city had internalized the lessons of the Toronto 1999 cold case, in ways that were almost invisible. Police stations hummed with quiet efficiency, files carefully indexed, evidence preserved, every interaction documented. Nothing spectacular. No banners. No ceremonies. Yet in this meticulous rhythm, a subtle cultural shift persisted. Officers who had once measured success in arrests now measured it in continuity, the degree to which questions could survive time, how well memory and evidence were conserved, how patiently investigations were maintained without forcing resolution before it was earned. The solved cold case had become a quiet teacher, instructing through the precision of process rather than the drama of outcome. Detectives who had labored on the file through decades of uncertainty carried its imprint into new cases. Their mentorship emphasized restraint, patience, and awareness. They taught recruits that assumptions are dangerous companions, that familiarity is no guarantee of safety, that every lead, no matter how minor, deserves careful consideration. The Toronto case was rarely named explicitly. Instead, its principles were embedded in culture. Always document, always preserve, always question. These became mantras whispered in briefing rooms, repeated in training exercises, observed in the cautious handling of evidence. Family interactions with law enforcement had evolved into a quiet collaboration. While the sister remained private, her occasional advice shaped protocols. She emphasized steady updates over sensational statements, clear timelines over speculative projections, and validation over promises. Her influence was measured but profound. It taught agencies that communication is an ongoing negotiation of care and patience, a recognition that families of victims experience time differently, that grief does not adhere to schedules. Community groups, too, absorbed lessons indirectly. Organizations once run or influenced by the familiar man revised volunteer screening, structured mentorship, and safety protocols. This was not reactionary paranoia. It was careful stewardship. People learned to build systems of accountability that outlast individuals. Social trust, once partially fractured, found new forms of resilience. Residents learned to observe patterns without immediate judgment, to act collectively without hysteria, to prioritize safety without sensationalism. The city's administrative apparatus absorbed the case into standard practice. Records management, data retention policies, archival techniques, and oversight mechanisms were all subtly recalibrated. Preservation was recognized as a proactive investment, not a bureaucratic obligation. Redundancy in digital and physical evidence storage became a baseline expectation, not a luxury. The case demonstrated that foresight matters, that the work done in years of quiet attention is often more consequential than any immediate action. Legal institutions refined doctrine. Judges referenced Toronto's approach in rulings regarding delayed evidence collection, DNA analysis, and cold case review procedures. Prosecutors and defense attorneys alike studied the layered approach, the careful sequencing of investigative steps, the deliberate avoidance of assumptions, the weighing of new technological tools against ethical boundaries. The city's jurisprudence subtly shifted, emphasizing process integrity as much as result. Justice became measured not just in verdicts but in how diligently truth was pursued over time. Media coverage matured alongside the city. Journalists learned to balance intrigue with restraint. Early headlines, marked by shock and speculation, gave way to analytical retrospectives that emphasized procedural rigor, ethical boundaries, and systemic lessons. Journalism schools cited the case as an example of reporting responsibly on long-running investigations, illustrating how to hold attention without exploiting trauma, how to narrate complexity without oversimplification. The story became a textbook reference, its influence quietly shaping the next generation of reporters. Educational institutions integrated the case into multiple disciplines. Criminal justice students studied it as a blueprint for balancing persistence and patience. Psychology students explored the evolution of memory over decades, and how narratives solidify in collective consciousness. Information science students analyzed how evidence retention and indexing affect investigative outcomes. In all these contexts, Toronto 1999 became less a story about crime than a lens for understanding time, uncertainty, and institutional resilience. The park, once a silent marker of tragedy, had fully returned to ordinary life. Parents and children moved through it without conscious reference to the past. Infrastructure upgrades, lighting, benches, clear sightlines, supported daily routines rather than memorialization. Safety had been embedded seamlessly into urban design, reflecting lessons that vigilance does not require spectacle. The absence of plaques or dedications underscored a philosophy that living spaces can honor memory by fostering continued life, rather than freezing it in narrative. For the officers directly involved in the investigation, the post-resolution years brought an unexpected form of emotional labor. Relief was tempered by the long-term weight of responsibility. They recognized that patience had been their greatest tool, that every preserved detail, every cautious choice, had allowed the case to succeed when it otherwise might have failed. Reflections were quiet, often shared in private mentoring sessions, shaping the next generation not through example of heroism, but through demonstration of discipline. The family's journey toward normalcy continued in subtle ways. They marked anniversaries privately, integrating remembrance into routine rather than spectacle. The sisters' approach emphasized continuity, honoring absence without letting it dominate presence. Her practice influenced broader conversations about coping strategies in cases of delayed justice, providing a vocabulary for resilience that was both measured and humane. Internationally, law enforcement and policy organizations used Toronto as a reference. The focus was not on forensic detail, but on governance. How long-term oversight, proper documentation, and ethical application of technology preserve both justice and legitimacy. Delegations observed workflows, discussed consent frameworks, and studied communication strategies. The city's experience demonstrated that disciplined process has implications far beyond its immediate jurisdiction, teaching that patient, principled practice transcends borders. In law enforcement culture, the case subtly redefined recognition. Commendations shifted from celebrating rapid arrests to honoring sustained diligence. Teams were praised for preservation, documentation, and procedural care. Success was reframed, not as finality but as enabling future possibility. The Toronto case had shown that delayed outcomes can carry as much significance as immediate victories, and that the work invested in patients becomes a lasting legacy. The influence of technology continued to expand cautiously. Genetic genealogy, once controversial, was carefully regulated. Oversight mechanisms, clear consent protocols, and transparent usage guidelines ensured that the tools served investigation without undermining rights. The Toronto file demonstrated the necessity of calibration. Power without constraint invites error, but power with restraint achieves results while protecting integrity. Private reflection remained central to the investigators and the family. While the public narrative emphasized resolution, internally, the ongoing negotiation of memory and responsibility persisted. Investigators revisited the case occasionally, not to change outcomes, but to evaluate process. Families lived with remembrance, integrating it into daily life without allowing it to dominate. Both parties engaged in subtle emotional stewardship, understanding that closure is rarely singular, that resolution arrives in waves. Community awareness evolved beyond reactive fear. Residents learned to perceive risk structurally rather than personally. Volunteer programs implemented procedures learned indirectly from the case. Careful documentation, proactive monitoring, structured oversight. Social trust was reinforced not by ignoring danger, but by embedding safeguards into routine practices. Vigilance became normalized, habitual, and quietly effective. Part 9 closes with the narrative's focus firmly on sustained impact. The Toronto 1999 cold case no longer exists as immediate news. Its power lies in infrastructure, cultural, procedural, and psychological. It demonstrates that patient, principled action leaves traces not in headlines but in habit, in ethics, in institutional memory. The city carries forward an invisible legacy. A discipline of care, the patience to let truth emerge, the vigilance to preserve it, and the understanding that justice, when treated as a long-term craft rather than a sprint, is a quiet, enduring force. The rhythm of daily life in Toronto absorbed the echoes of the 1999 cold case in ways that few could pinpoint, yet all felt subtly. City officials, community leaders, and law enforcement alike carried the lessons forward in habits, not speeches. The city's infrastructure of accountability, painstakingly rebuilt over decades, functioned quietly in the background, reinforcing vigilance without spectacle. In precincts, officers handled evidence with methodical care, each document labeled precisely, each chain of custody meticulously maintained, as if every paper and photograph could speak decades into the future. They knew instinctively that the past is fragile, and that patience is not passive but active, demanding sustained attention and discipline. Detectives trained under the veterans of the case internalized its subtleties. They learned that familiarity can be dangerous, that neighbors, friends, and community figures may conceal layers of ambiguity beneath ordinary appearances. They practiced interviews with a cadence shaped by restraint, emphasizing listening over presumption, observation over assumption. The Toronto case was often referenced obliquely in training scenarios, never as a story of horror, never as a tale of heroism, but as a template for procedural rigor, demonstrating that the architecture of investigation is as critical as the acts themselves. Patience, documentation, and restraint became embedded virtues. The family's interactions with institutions evolved into collaboration marked by intentionality. Updates were measured, carefully framed, acknowledging the slow passage of time without inflating expectations. The sister's voice, restrained yet firm, influenced procedural norms. Families were to be treated as partners, their needs for information balanced against the integrity of the ongoing investigation. Her approach emphasized endurance over immediacy, illustrating that justice requires both time and transparency. These protocols became codified across municipal divisions, shaping outreach, communication, and engagement strategies. Neighborhoods learned the subtle art of vigilance. Residents did not surveil with fear, but engaged with community awareness. Volunteer organizations implemented structured mentorship and oversight, embedding procedural care into civic engagement. Safety became a matter of design, social norms, and mutual responsibility, a framework where residents participated in protective measures without descending into paranoia. Toronto's cultural shift emphasized systemic resilience over reactive behavior, building a social fabric that was attentive yet composed. City administration internalized the case as a model for governance. Record-keeping, archival practices, and evidence storage underwent systematic improvements, designed to endure decades. Digital systems were redundantly mirrored, indexing methods carefully standardized, and accountability protocols strengthened. Toronto had demonstrated that thorough, methodical processes, sustained over time, produce outcomes far beyond the immediate visible impact. Patience became institutionalized, a metric as essential as arrests or clearances. Legal systems, too, evolved in the shadow of the case. Judges cited Toronto's approach in discussions of delayed evidence, forensic admissibility, and cold case procedure, emphasizing the interplay between timing, integrity, and technological innovation. Prosecutors recalibrated thresholds for action, ensuring that charges were based on robust evidence rather than narrative pressure. Defense attorneys acknowledged the case as an example of balance, patient investigation that preserved rights while enabling resolution. The city's jurisprudence subtly shifted toward procedural sustainability, embedding caution, integrity, and rigor into the fabric of the law. Media discourse matured alongside institutional learning. Journalists trained to report responsibly on cold cases, focusing on systemic lessons rather than sensational narratives. Retrospectives highlighted decision-making, procedural oversight, and technological evolution, using Toronto as a model of long-term accountability. Editorial practices emphasized context, analytical depth, and ethical responsibility, reshaping public perception of investigative work. The city's story was no longer defined by the crime itself, but by the endurance, diligence, and care with which it had been pursued. Educational institutions integrated the case across multiple disciplines. Criminal justice students studied it as a blueprint for patience, procedural fidelity, and ethical conduct. Information science programs examined indexing, metadata integrity, and archival rigor, using the case to demonstrate how infrastructure shapes outcomes. Psychology classes analyzed memory drift, witness perception, and long-term trauma. Public policy programs considered governance lessons, how oversight, documentation, and procedural patience stabilize outcomes across complex, time-extended systems. Toronto 1999 became a lens through which institutions examined the intersection of human behavior, process, and time. Public spaces subtly reflected the lessons learned. The park, once a site of private grief and public speculation, became a space of ordinary life, transformed through careful urban planning. Lighting, sightlines, and maintenance schedules were designed to foster safety without drawing attention to past tragedies. Community members moved through it with awareness, not alarm. Children played freely, parents watched attentively, and neighbors interacted with subtle vigilance rooted in infrastructure rather than fear. The city demonstrated that physical space could embody lessons of care and responsibility, integrating memory into design without memorialization or spectacle. Technological oversight evolved in parallel. Genetic genealogy, DNA databases, and analytical software were incorporated under strict ethical and operational standards. Consent, transparency, and proportionality governed use. Toronto's experience demonstrated the importance of restraint. Powerful tools could produce results, but only when applied within an ethical, accountable framework. Departments worldwide visited Toronto to observe governance practices, learning that technology without culture produces risk, While culture without method produces inefficiency, the case became an international reference point, a study in harmonizing innovation with ethics. The social psychology of vigilance shifted. Residents became aware of subtle risks without succumbing to fear-driven behavior. Volunteer organizations emphasized accountability, mentorship, and structured oversight, instilling habits of precaution while maintaining trust. Social cohesion improved as residents learned to embed protective practices into routine life. Safety and awareness became cultural norms, not reactions to trauma. The Toronto case demonstrated that trust can coexist with structured vigilance, and that communities flourish when informed by process rather than emotion. Within law enforcement, recognition shifted toward procedural diligence rather than dramatic arrests. Commendations emphasized preservation, documentation, and sustained attention. Teams were celebrated for their careful management of uncertainty rather than immediate closure. The Toronto case exemplified that long-term integrity carries significance, and that the most impactful outcomes often arrive quietly, through patience, persistence, and disciplined stewardship. Families affected by unresolved cases look to Toronto for guidance, learning to navigate uncertainty without despair. Support networks emphasize communication, endurance, and process literacy, teaching families how to live alongside unresolved questions. The case provided a vocabulary for resilience, how to integrate grief, maintain hope, and participate constructively in procedural systems while preserving personal agency. Investigators continued reflective practice. The officers who worked on the original case shared lessons on the long-term psychological dimensions of delayed resolution. Emotional labor was ongoing, balancing closure with memory, managing personal trauma, and mentoring the next generation. They recognized that patience is not passive but requires sustained cognitive, emotional, and procedural investment. The Toronto case became a study in endurance, highlighting how long-term engagement shapes professional culture, family dynamics, and public trust. As Part 10 concludes, the narrative centers on influence and diffusion, rather than immediate resolution. The Toronto 1999 cold case lives not in headlines but in habits, not in sensational recounting, but in institutional memory, ethical practice, community awareness, and procedural resilience. Its power lies in the slow, cumulative shaping of systems, practices, and relationships. A legacy measured not in applause, but in endurance, integrity, and the patient pursuit of justice across decades. The case teaches that justice is a discipline, patience is a tool, and process is a medium through which truth survives. In Toronto, the lessons have become invisible scaffolding, shaping the city, its institutions, and its residents quietly, persistently, ensuring that when the next cold case emerges, it encounters not chaos, but preparedness, reflection, and care.